Good morning, everyone. Afternoon for the folks on the East Coast. My name is Crystal Ellington. I am the Communications Director here at Minority Veterans of America, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all to Summit 2021. So the panel we're going to be on today is Race Bias and the Case for Reparations for Black Veterans, and we're just going to dive right in. If there's one topic that's more controversial than racial bias and discrimination in the military and veteran community, it's reparations. After World War II, many racial and ethnic minority veterans were denied access to earned benefits through the Service Members Readjustment Act of 1944, or the GI Bill. Now, the bill was introduced and designed as a tool to create a middle class of veterans, but was done to the exclusion of those who were redlined out of specific neighborhoods, denied access to home loans, were unable to attend institutions of higher learning due to segregation, and were denied disability benefits due to systemic bias. The results of these policies and legacies they've built in the community can be seen in the inequitable outcomes for racial and ethnic minority veterans, and especially for Black and African American veterans. This panel will discuss the case for reparations for Black veterans, the work being done by advocates, and what it means to repair a past riddled with racism, bias, and systemic discrimination. So we have three panelists with us today. So first is going to be Richard Brookshire. Now, Richard is the co-founder, former executive director, and present board chair for the Black Veterans Project. As a storyteller, Richard leverages a background in integrated marketing, digital advocacy, and documentary filmmaking to deliver strategic and dynamic social impact campaigns. His portfolio to date spans issues relating to racial and economic justice, workforce development, diversity and inclusion, and military and veteran affairs. Richard received his MPA in urban policy with a specialization in media and advocacy from Columbia University, a BA in political science, magna cum laude from Fordham University, and is a former infantry combat medic and U.S. Army veteran of the war in Afghanistan. His work has been highlighted by the New York Times, USA Today, Reuters, The Washington Post, BBC, CNN, The Root, and the list goes on. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Richard. Our next panelist is Travis Socher. He is a same gender-loving African-American graduate student pursuing a Master of Science in International and Intercultural Education. That was a mouthful, to include a graduate certificate in African and African Diaspora Studies with Florida International University. In addition, he is a graduate of the Honors College at Florida International University with a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations to include 2 undergraduate certificates, Afro-Latino Studies and Human Rights Political Transitions. In May 2021, he started a company called T. Dozier Consulting, which offers academic and career life coaching, individualized diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and international travel designing. Moreover, he is a U.S. Army combat vet who hails from West Georgia and East Alabama, but now calls Miami home. He loves cooking, fine dining, reading, and traveling. Good morning, Travis. All right, and our last panel that we have this afternoon is going to be Willis Gordon. He is an author, essayist, activist, and veteran of the War on Terror. Gordon is committed to the improvement of our communities through education, action, and inclusion. He produced and organized the Rock the Block voter registration and education concert in 2016, and continues to register voters across Stark County and the greater Ohio area. He has canvassed, advised, or field organized in 4 presidential elections and countless local elections. He's currently the chairman of Political Education and Outreach, Communications and Community Engagement, Press and Publicity, and Veteran Affairs for the Stark County NAACP. He's the author of 2 short story collections, as well as the syndicated column, The Road Forward, featuring An Unlikely Stories and The Devil's Strip. He was also the creator and host of Impolite Conversation, a YouTube discussion show about finding solutions to our community's problems without getting stuck on our differences. A firm optimist, Gordon believes love is not just tender, but tough. And the only way the arc of history bends towards justice is through the hard work of ordinary people. Everyone, please welcome all of our panelists today. We are so glad to have you here once again, and we're going to just jump right into the questions. So the first question is going to be for all of our panelists. So each of you has worked to address some of the disparities that Black veterans face through your work. Can you kick us off by sharing a bit about your work and the deepest disparities you believe Black veterans face? And I'm just going to go in order across my screen. We'll start with Willis.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me here, and I'm glad to be here and with all of you today. It's good to see folks, even if we are just virtual. So the last thing there, again, I got to add more stuff and more hats into the bio. I was just nominated as the chairman for the state of Ohio Veterans Affairs Committee for the NAACP. So the thing about this work and finding these things and also trying to do political activism is it's a lot of the times it's messaging, but it's also changing people's thought process. And one of the most challenging things about that, especially for Black veterans, is including us in the conversation. Now, when most people talk about veterans, when most people talk about these things, they have a very specific image of what a veteran looks like. And sometimes we're not always in that picture. A lot of the times, going all the way back to the revolution, Black Americans have been, serving and sacrificing their time, their talent, their strength, and their lives at times for this country. And oftentimes we are not included in that conversation. So getting people to also understand Black veterans are a massive part of veterans affairs and veterans relations, to just know that some of these access points that we're trying to get, they're extremely important, and we have to focus up on not just the white male veterans who might have PTSD, but also Black veterans of all stripes who are in serious need of economic attention once they come home.
Absolutely, totally agreed, Willis. I think having us as part of the conversation is more than likely the only way we're going to start the discussion and be able to really voice the Black veterans' opinions and needs and thoughts. So thank you for that. So next panelist we'll have answer is Travis.
Crystal, thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with Willis and with Richard. The issue that I've been seeing for the past 5 years as of being a veteran is the character of discharges. And that goes back to the unequal punishment of UCMJ. While the Black service member is in the military, they get some of the most harshest punishment for the same infractions that somebody who is non-Black will get a lesser punishment. Being here in Miami, I've helped veterans, a lot of Black veterans who have bad conduct discharges or other than honorable discharges, help them walk them through the process of getting their discharges upgraded so that way they can use some of their benefits as they continue to go on the road to recovering from their negative impact for being in the military. And also, that's a systemic thing because it's easy to look at, as Willis said, it's easy to look at, veterans, from a white male, perspective, which also can come from a colorblind perspective of, inclusivity, but that's not the case. And as I continue to advocate for education and benefit advocacy, I'm continuing to work with those Black veterans who really need the help with upgrading their discharge.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Travis. And Richard, we'll have you go next.
I think Willis and Travis both hit really important marks. One about having Black vets not only just be part of the conversation, but lead the conversation around what they feel is a fair, a fair discourse around restitution and restorative justice and repairing the long harms that have been done. And then to Travis's point about dishonorable discharges obviously being one component of that. When I look at the race conversation, and even just as it manifests in the present day, but also looking at the historical narrative, I think that's one of the through lines and what we're trying to accomplish with the Black Veterans Project, and having data kind of be a starting point for much of that. When I think about the building of generational wealth, or just the ability for Black vets or vets writ large to have some semblance of economic security when they get out, it's through the lens of three things. One being retirement, the second being disability allocation, and the third being access to the GI Bill. And so there are predominant numbers of ways that Black folk have been obstructed from access to those three things. one of the main things that we've been focusing on as a kind of starting point over the last year, because our project is a decade-long endeavor. What we've been working on most substantively has been in partnership with Yale Law School, looking at disparities in disability allocation, historically and present day. And so some of the data that we've been able to glean that hasn't actually been made public, that people don't actually, have the hard figures around. I mean, we know that obviously Black folks know that racism is pervasive in the Department of Veteran Affairs and also in the military, but they don't have the concrete numbers to show that the VA actually knows it. And when you have the concrete numbers, it starts a whole different conversation. And so just one of the data points that we were able to glean that supports conclusions that Black vets have long had, and this data point had only come to us about 2 weeks ago, was that Black veterans today are 29% less likely to get a disability for PTSD. And so that's just one specific area. Our work is much more expansive than that, and looking much more expansively at data points. So that's how we're starting the conversation, and including ourselves in the conversation is by equipping ourselves with the weapons necessary to have a fair fight, which is the data that we know that the VA has.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Richard. And I can personally attest to that. I've had quite a few fellow service members that will not get diagnosed for PTSD because their therapists don't see them as having, mental issues or mental health problems because they're a person of color. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to go off script a little bit because everyone's responses gave me a question. So what would you say to the majority vets out there, so the white, male, heteronormative vets who say that our organizations like NBA, like Black Veterans Project, like the NAACP, we're being racist and segregationist and that we should not see color?
Got it. I got it.
I think we all got it.
I want to jump in there.
Everybody's like, put me in.
You know what? I'll make it quick. I want to chime in on that.
Okay.
I've heard this conversation a lot in discourse, throughout the last couple of years. And I will always ask them, what can you do to make, the policies and the things that are out there color conscious instead of color blind? Because if we weren't dealing with the legacy of slavery, institutional racism that come from people that look like you and descendants that look like you, then maybe we wouldn't have, minority vets or Black vets or some of these things to accommodate our experiences, because all our experiences aren't the same.
Right.
So I think that the major thing is, and I think, let me make sure that I have this right. So they're saying that, organizations like ours or like the NAACP or like, any other Black veterans organizations, we're racist because we shouldn't see color. So the first thing I like to do is I like to do little definitions. People who are coming from a historically disadvantaged place aren't racist. It's usually not how that works, since racism is a power dynamic. But right. The other thing I'd like to say is, normally, and this is how I handle this, is we're dealing with something that is historically proven and it is incredibly pervasive. So that if you want to be part of this fight and that you don't think we should exist, well, guess what? We're trying to work ourselves out of a job, frankly. Is that
right? Exactly.
In a position where, thank you, son. We should be in a position where, we work hard enough to the point where these disparities close, and now the need for us is no longer there. So not only those 2 points, and the third point really is that colorblind should not be the problem. Because if you're not the bad guy, if you're not the racist, you should be able to recognize them. And the fact that you don't see color would also mean that you don't see when people are treated differently because of their color. And that's a blind spot for you. So that's something where, you have to be conscious of, okay, well, we can't just, I think, as you said, color conscious, not color blind. And don't mind me if I steal that, because that's pretty good.
He's like, I'm writing that.
But I think that's honestly where we have to be and how we have to communicate that, instead of getting in the mud with people and fighting over them. Just let them know, like, listen, there's a reason why you shouldn't be colorblind, because you need to be able to recognize when your brothers and your sisters are getting hit and being targeted. So you need to be able to see that, and you need to be able to recognize that. And if you claim to be, somebody who's on the side of justice, then, you'd be with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Richard, your turn.
I mean, I think they made the most salient points there. And I'll say, just on behalf of the work that I do, I mean, I've worked at some of these more historical based organizations that claim to be inclusive of all vets, and they're not. They've always had racial blind spots, and that's why projects like ours manifested. And then second, I do think for me, it's a deflection of my time and my spirit to focus on those that feel I'm off course. I know that there are very many generations of Black vets that are grateful for the work that I'm doing, and that's where my focus lies. So I actually don't really engage the detractors or those that want to gaslight, because if you know history, there's no way that you could even propagate a framework like that and be serious. So, yeah.
Well, thank you all for those thoughts. I'll put those in my back pocket next time I get trolled on Facebook. All right, so for the next question, Willis, we're going to start with you. So history is your thing, so help us break it down. Give us a brief history of how we got here. If you can share a little bit about how, and possibly during what eras the wealth gap was created and how it was exacerbated for Black vets.
Okay, so there's a two-tier system here, right? So there's the historical one, which is, you know, post World War II, which is the most popular thing that everybody likes to talk to, and I'm going to focus mostly on that. But I would like to have a shout out for the Reconstruction era and the post Civil War era, because there are still a lot of Black Civil War veterans that people don't necessarily talk about, especially when these issues come up. I think that people often look over the fact that Black veterans and Black folks in general, at least men, were serving in Congress and were, you know, in different places in society than they were, you know, I'd say 30 years later, immediately after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period. And I think that I think that some of the coups that happened on American soil, where some of the Black Fusionist Party and the Republicans at that point were overthrown by white supremacist Democrats, places like Wilmington in the Carolinas, those things started to sort of dispossess Black veterans and set us back. And so when it comes to the 40s and 50s and 60s, at least Black men are fighting for a right that had been taken from them originally. So by the time we get to, you know, the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s, you know, the end result of that today, white Americans have an average of $171,000 of net worth, let's say, for a white family. And in Black America, it's around 17,600. So it's about 10 times less. But that starts because right after World War II, only 2% of Black veterans were able to get a home loan from the VA or the FHA. And coming home from that, my grandfather was in Patton's Army. And coming home from fighting in France, fighting in Europe, fighting in Germany, making these sacrifices in Europe with every other American that was over there, they're coming home and getting less than. White American.
Oh, Willis, somehow you went on mute. We can't hear you.
So we got Red Summer in 1919 instead of the embrace that a lot of other veterans got. In the aftermath of World War II, a lot of things ended up happening where we weren't getting the GI Bill, so the expansion of the middle class that you saw in the 1950s was not also a Black experience. That ended up happening later because it took until the Fair Housing Act of 1968 for these things to sort of start being enforced and to say, okay, well, we have to outlaw, you know, criminal discrimination in housing. But unfortunately, it took about 24 years before the Federal Reserve System actually started enforcing it. And even to this day, it's a little spotty. I see that stuff at work every day, where there's still consistently Fair Housing Act lawsuits and complaints and gaps in people's vision. So historically speaking, it seeds out throughout American history. World War I, the Civil War. But World War II is this sort of nexus point for when things really took off in the 1950s as far as wealth is concerned, for what was historically a lower class of person who was going to serve in the military. But you created this middle class for white America, and Black America got cut out. Not only did we get redlined, we couldn't get loans. We couldn't get a home loan, but just personal loans and business loans as well. So it held us back a generation from creating the same sort of wealth. And so when you see white flight into the suburbs, we're left in these urban areas, in these urban centers. And because of the fact that the wages are lower in those jobs, we end up historically earning less and get a cap put on our wages when our brothers, our white brothers who were fighting in the same army, in the same war, got different benefits and got to leapfrog ahead. So that's really the historical seeds of it. And that tends to be something that we don't really talk about in polite company, but it is an indelible fact, and we can't get around it. You know, just that segregation piece alone in Chicago. I mean, they just saw this. I just saw the statistic, I think in Heather McGee's book, that in Chicago alone, segregation cost workers $4.4 billion in income. That is over the course of the years, just segregation. It hurts. Not only does it hurt us, but it also hurts white America, because the entire economy is missing $4.4 billion in one of our major cities. I mean, think about what that's like in New York, in Cleveland, in Atlanta, in Los Angeles. All of these wages are missing because of the fact that we couldn't get it together enough as a country to treat us all equally. And that's really the historical background of how we got to where we are today. That's really where it is.
Wow, awesome. Well, thank you for putting a neat little bow on that and explaining why we need reparations and where the money is. So thanks for that. So next question is going to Travis. So Travis, Willis talked about the wealth gap. Paint us a picture, if you will. If Black veterans had received the same access to the GI Bill, VA home loans, and also equitable access to other programs guaranteed to service members after World War II, what would the veteran community and the country at large look like today?
Oh, that's a great question, Crystal. And Willis, thanks for your response. I'm going to try to unpack it as neatly as possible because my mind go all over the place, because this is a really great question. Just to be honest, after World War II, Black veterans did have access to the GI Bill. However, because the language inside the GI Bill did not specifically exclude African Americans from using the GI Bill. However, the structure of white supremacy was an obstacle for Black veterans using the GI benefits, because we got to look at the history of how the bill was done. Back in the 1940s and 50s, states, the federal government mandates states to be the administrators of the program. So therefore, there was a lot of disparity within that system. Secondly, if Black people were given the opportunity to use the benefits, there were no system there to help guide and coach them in using the benefits, as far as education or health benefits, or even psychological benefits. Because moving a little forward, I go to therapy, and my therapy is my therapist is trained in racialized trauma. So being that a lot of therapists aren't trained in racialized trauma, we can imagine that that wasn't a benefit back then in those days. And the third is, just like today, even like yesterday, Black veterans are getting dishonorably discharged even for the smallest infractions in compared to whites and other groups. So in theory, if we were to have equitable access as our white counterparts back then, there would still be some underlying issues, because we're talking about 60 to 70 years after the Reconstruction era, 80 years after Civil War. So the racialized climate of the country wasn't as progressive or somewhat succinct as it is today. So in order for Black veterans to really enjoy those benefits and have true access to the benefit, it should be some type of accommodation, extra accommodation, which I've mentioned in prior conversation. Because if we look at the bill is all color, and because I look at the policies here in the United States in two ways: color blind or color conscious. And the GI Bill is color conscious. Color blind. And I stand corrected, because it allowed a lot of improprieties and a lot of insidious actions that stifled access for Black veterans to take part into these benefits. And because there were no accommodations that were specific towards Black veterans, even having access back then would not lead to the economic and the political prosperity of Black veterans and their descendants today.
You mentioned one word, and I feel like it is very incendiary for some people, and that's the word accommodations. And I think a lot of people get triggered by that because they don't understand the difference between equality and equity. Could you speak a little bit more to that, like the difference and how people can understand that having these accommodations isn't given a special treatment?
Sure. Excuse me. With equality, it's the notion that everybody has the same, everybody's on the same equal playing field. Everybody has equal access, but that's not the case for speaking for the Black experiences, because our experience is very unique from other groups of people. And because of our experiences, we're going to need certain things that our white counterparts will not need. As I've mentioned earlier about, we could talk about PTSD and mental health. We're all getting treated for PTSD or some sort, which I like to believe. But at the same time, a lot of Black veterans, I ask them, I'm like, is your therapist trained in racialized trauma? Because yes, you're a veteran, but yet you're still Black and you're still having unique experiences on top of being a veteran. Or do you have, or for the Black female, do you have a therapist that's trained in female trauma and things of that nature? So therefore, having these extra accommodations is equitable to our experience, not so much of saying that, we're better or just having a supremacist thought to what equity is supposed to be, but it's more of a holistic approach of saying we're treating the whole person and treating our whole experience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, Richard, so your work with Black Veterans Project highlights that the issue of racial bias and discrimination isn't just a historical issue, but it's one that's alive and well even today. Can you tell us a bit about your work to unearth this bias and how it has exacerbated the wealth gap for Black veterans?
Yeah, man, like I was hinting at before at the top of the conversation, is so many people who are looking at the conversation around reparations relative to Black vets are focused on the GI Bill. And I believe that's a really important part of the conversation, but it doesn't stop there. Like I said, everything from retirement to disability. When you talk about obstruction, you have to think about the trillions of dollars that have been funneled out of the Black community through Black veterans because of obstruction, whether it be through the GI Bill, retirement, and or disability. And so our major focus over the course of the last year and a half has been around disability claims. We have a forthcoming project looking at retirement disparities, and we're taking one specific, I can't really speak to it quite right yet, but it's a very interesting undertaking that will likely be in partnership with Harvard Law School's Veterans Legal Clinic. So our work with Yale has been focused on FOIA-ing, looking at granular race-based data post 9/11 is what we had initially FOIA'd. We've since learned that the VA has much more expansive data, so we're re-FOIA-ing to go back all the way to the beginning of when the department was founded to look at all the data that they do have. Because I think also when you think about today, oftentimes people forget about the past, and insofar as you have Vietnam vets, Gulf War vets, you have Korean War vets that are very much still alive and were obstructed, and no one wants to have a viable conversation about them, especially when you're exclusively focused on World War II. There's 4, 5, 6 generations, that are like excluded, and their experiences are valid too. I think these issues are complicated, and I think that's why there was a need for a storytelling apparatus to kind of tie the historical narrative for folks. And so that's what we've been trying to do, and we've been mostly working with the media to do that. 3 years ago, when we started our project, there was literally pretty much no conversation on the internet in any substantive fashion, and definitely in media, around the historical ramifications of racism, both in the military and across the veteran space, and certainly nothing of substance and utility around racism as it stands now in the military and how that affects Black veterans even to this day. And so much of our starting point for our work has been to get the stories out there, to make sure that vets have access to producers, to be on television shows, to be in the New York Times, to be in the Washington Post, to be speaking to these issues with a level of authority as well, right? So that they only have just their anecdotal experience and maybe the collective experience to draw from, but actual hard data that they can then accompany, and we can drive home things like legislation. So when we think about just tying the bow on what we were just talking about with the GI Bill, the Isaac Woodard bill that was just put forth on Veterans Day by Congressman Moulton and Congressman Clyburn that looks to give the direct descendants of Black World War II veterans access to the GI Bill. People have to understand what the historical underpinnings of that are in a salient and digestible way, so that we can get the political momentum to actually have it passed. If passed, it would be the most consequential reparations package that Black America has ever really received. And I can already see the conversation being the price tag is too large. The price tag is, I mean, as of right now, I think they're not being so public with it, but it's going to become public because the Republicans are going to make it an issue. It's around like $30 billion. And when you think about how the quite literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families that can be affected by this legislation, and the fact that we have a multi-trillion-dollar military budget every single year, it's dropped in the bucket. And so anyway, I'm kind of going a little bit in many different places, because to Travis's point, it's hard to kind of have a neat conversation around all of this. It's very complex. And so I think when I talk about at least what we're trying to do is bucket it out. So I kind of use the disability claim process and procedures that have been our main area of focus to study at the start of our project to be the defense budget is 20 billion. Okay, thank you. But yeah, so I don't think that's true. It's actually in the trillions of dollars. But yes, the NDAA is $1 trillion budget. But yeah, so go ahead.
He's like, as you were. So Richard, would you actually say that data is possibly going to be the bridge between actually asking for reparations and having this abstract thought to actually proving, hey, this is why we need this and this is the way forward?
So I think also when I think about reparations, I think about a multitude of pathways, right? It shouldn't just look like one thing, because there were multiple different ways that Black folk were harmed. And so, we know that the legislation is there. How can we build out storytelling? How can we organize Black vets to put the political pressure to educate the public so that bill can pass? That being one thing. But the heart of our work with Yale is around litigation. And so based off of the data points that we've been able to glean, and I guess I'll just announce it at the Minority Vets Summit. We are looking into filing the first of a series of lawsuits that would take the claim of a particular Black vet who has experienced discrimination that is accompanied by data that proves gross negligence on the part of the VA. And so there has been lawsuits levied in the past by Black vets who allege discrimination in different ways, but they didn't have the proof. We have gotten proof. It gives a different not only political weight to what we're trying to do, but also gives a different legal argument that we can prove intended gross negligence. And so that is something that we're beginning to explore and thinking about what that will look like. And so those are conversations we were literally having like last week with Yale's team. So yeah, you accompany the data and whistleblower testimony and and then also just emails from VA officials back and forth to each other, and you realize, that they've known this issue is happening and they've actually been really negligent to solve it. That gives a lot of legal ground for individuals who are bringing claims to stand on. So
Really. Yeah, so I am really excited to see what precedent that sets for having discriminatory lawsuits brought against the military. So I'm excited to see how that goes. So I'm gonna move right along because we're running a little low on time. I've had a lot of sidebar questions. So as y'all have laid out, there's an extreme wealth gap today. How has this manifested in outcomes for the Black veteran community? What are the impacts of the inequities Black veterans face historically and continue to face today? If you could give us some examples of what that looks like, that'd be awesome.
Sure. I think that the stereotypical quote unquote American experience, if you were to look at it through the lens of like popular culture or even just the popular narrative, there's a poor country boy from whatever rural or southern middle part of the country, goes off, joins the military in World War II, comes home, uses the GI Bill, moves to the suburbs, gets this, this house, 2.5 kids, white picket fence, and a dog, gets this stuff together. His kids go to college, they end up making more money than him, and then they end up having children who are in this current generation now, and they are set up in a different way than their peers of color. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of people who are in, I'd say, like the upper middle class of America kind of share that story. Share that story of the, back from World War II, this is how they, they created this money this way. And they're not crazy wealthy, but they're in a position where they are comfortable. And I think that in Black America, we missed a step there because so much of the things that happened with these inequities, and not just after World War II, but after Vietnam and after Korea, where the step up coming home didn't happen for us, or for many. And because of this is where you see, as I talked about, the net worth, that comes from owning homes, that comes from having family homes and legacy homes and things like that, where that, oh, hey, guess what? You don't have to deal with a house payment or a mortgage payment. This was paid off 20 years ago. You can just live here. And the fact of the matter is that makes your cash and your income much more liquid, and it's not tied up in house payments, car payments, and things of that nature. So I think that how that has sort of impacted us is that now, if you look at this generation of Black veterans, if we are coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're using the GI Bill like I have, I'm starting in a 1946 position in 2019. You know what I mean? Where I'm getting my kids into a position where they should have been 2 generations ago. And so now, instead of stacking the money or putting it into a different investment or doing this or that, I'm trying to make sure that everybody else comes up as well. And so I think that our counterparts did not have that same, or at least not in recent generations, didn't have that same burden of responsibility. And because of that, and that shows not just in veterans, but everywhere. You look at athletes, Black athletes and things like that, they're constantly bringing the whole hood with them. That's what ends up happening is we feel a need to pull everybody else up. And because that's what you're supposed to do with your family. But because of the fact that it's happening to us now, we're in a position where we are making those sacrifices in real time. Whereas for our counterparts, they've been made, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so that paints a completely different landscape for what I'm trying to do versus what somebody else who is in Afghanistan tried to do at the same time.
Thank you, Willis. Richard, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, could you ask the question one more time?
Sure. So what are the impacts of the inequities Black veterans face historically and continue to face today?
I think we've kind of hammered that home. The impact is exactly what Willis said. You have a generational harm that has been done that does place Black folk at a significant disadvantage, specifically African Americans. So yeah, I say African Americans because Black folk aren't a monolith either. So which I think people don't talk enough about. So yeah, I would just reiterate what Willis said. I think he hit it right on the nose.
Awesome. And Travis, any other thoughts you'd like to add?
Nope. It was all said and ironed out perfectly by Mr. Gordon.
Awesome.
Ohio is very lucky to have you, Willis.
Yes, agreed. All right, so I'm sorry, Willis, did you have something to add?
Sure. I had a question.
Okay.
So, because I figure if we have a second that we didn't spend on the rest of those questions, I just had a second. I just wanted to ask. So if you're suing, if you're doing the lawsuits for the VA and you're coming up on doing these things, my question is, because that sounds incredible and that sounds like it's going to be some real bombshell stuff. My question is, how do you translate that into political pressure considering the current climate? So you've got a very implacable, 50 Republican senators, and then you've got a fairly decent side of the Democratic senators who, let's say, lack the political fortitude to vote for something like a full-on reparations pact. And so I think that this sort of legacy bill about World War II that Representative Clyburn introduced was actually a really interesting start to it, because I want to see what the temperature is in Congress for this. And I'm interested to see, because here in Ohio, I'm trying to figure out, how do I speak to Tim Ryan, who's running for Senate? How do I speak to Sherrod Brown, who's currently in the Senate, and talk to the people who are going into Chantel Brown, who's now coming into Congress? How do I speak to them and say, listen, this is something that we're interested in the Black community, and the NAACP is looking at and says that this looks good to us. I can talk to them here, but I'm wondering what you think the temperature is, and how to translate that into the proper political pressure to get these things passed.
Right. Well, I think that's part of the reason that we're taking multiple angles, right? Because we understand that the political climate and things getting done on the Hill is much more complicated and is a years-long undertaking. And so there has to be multiple avenues and multiple hands in different buckets. I will say one of the most important elements that we've been able to begin to fortify is a coalition, which I'm happy to hear about you and me for the first time, Willis, because I'd love you to come and take part in this coalition. It's called the Black Veterans Empowerment Council. Now, it was born out of a roundtable that the House Veteran Affairs Committee had convened last year. The years are passing by, but it may have been 2 years ago now. And so that is essentially an amalgamation of most of the Black veteran organizations from across the country, and we're trying to centralize our advocacy. And so one of the bigger things that we're going to be publishing at the top of next year is the first ever Black Veterans Policy Agenda. And for us, it's just like, how do we kind of get our ass salient and clear in one specific document, and then we can use that as a political tool as we go and relationship build. But the thing is that you have all of these other veterans organizations that do have a lot of political weight. The reason why veterans organizations in general have a lot of political weight is because the government is scared of what they could inevitably do if they don't get their demands met. And that's been true historically, all the way back to the Civil War, right? And so taking some notes out of history and different ways that veterans have been successful at putting political pressure. I'm not going to give all of our plans away, but we have thought about what does all the different ways that political pressure needs to be brought to bear. That does include the media, that does include organizing ourselves as Black veterans organizations, all being in conversation with each other, them understanding kind of what we're doing on the data front, what a class action might look like that we all have to coalesce and collaborate. Otherwise, none of it's going to get accomplished. We're just all going to be running in circles, which is what has been happening, I think, historically. And I do think there is a new generation, a new moment that perhaps the upcoming leadership of these more storied veterans organizations may inevitably come around to wanting to support and helping us bring political pressure to bear. But I think just in general, I mean, they've been having a difficult time even passing a burn pit bill, so, is it going to be easy? No, but that's part of why we need to think expansively about the different avenues that might be available to us to actuate something. And we haven't even started to think about, okay, what can we do at the state and local level, knowing that the GI Bill was adjudicated at the state level? Is there something that the states can do themselves? Is there something that municipalities can do specifically for Black veterans? Like there can be a more expansive framework here, but that takes time, that takes talent to build. And so I'm hoping we can talk offline, Willis.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
All right, well, this has been very enlightening. We have about 2 minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I just want to thank all of our panelists today. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully all of our attendees got something out of it as well. Just going to use the last couple of minutes to let you guys have any last minute thoughts or things that you'd want to say before we sign off.
Well, thank you guys for holding space for a conversation like this. I think I've been in the vet space for a while, and these conversations don't happen often. So just hats off to you all and for the success of the summit. And for anyone who wants to learn more about Black Veterans Project and the work that we're doing, we've been around for 3 years, but we're very much still just getting started. So visit blackveteransproject.org.
Well, Crystal, thanks for having me. And I'd like to thank Ashley for inviting me on being on the panel. And it was a pleasure having a discourse with Richard and Willis. And also I've learned a lot because most of Richard and Willis, they're out in the forefront. I'm in the back, doing some strategic things, doing the insidious things to make some things happen in the background, because everybody does not need to be in the forefront. But there was a great space that we had, and I thank you again.
Thanks, Travis.
Well, I want to say thank you for holding the space and for having us here. This is always a great opportunity for folks to come together and talk. Because when they first brought it to me, I said I don't want to be like Trump promising people that coal's coming back. You know what I mean? I want to have some real, genuine, strategic discussions about how we can pinpoint these things here. Because if we can just say, yeah, we can get reparations done, I want to know how we can actually get this stuff accomplished, and being able to pinpoint the historical implications and pinpoint how this is happening. And I think Richard brought some incredible stuff with data to show people, like, this is a real issue, and it is still pervasive to this day. This is not something that happened a million years ago. We're still feeling the radiation of these issues today, right now. So I think that that's incredibly important. I'm glad everybody came and listened, so that we could have this, we could wrap some big brains around this, because this is.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And I look forward to all of the work you're doing in this space. And we appreciate your time, and enjoy the rest of Summit.